You are putting together, I imagine, part of the working document that will become the Labour Party manifesto. Is there stuff here? Are there things here that will inform that?
Of course, and manifestos are really important, but I wouldn't want to dampen your expectations, but I think manifestos are increasingly broad brush these days. So I don't think you're going to see reams of detailed policy documents for a number of reasons. Some of them are very good reasons. Frankly, we don't have the capacity to do that. But also, I think we want to set out broad aims and aspirations, and that's why we have lots of civil servants and people to help us translate those into practice. I don't know all the answers. That's why I come here and seek people out who can help us with them. But I think you've seen from the announcements that Keir Starmer made earlier in the year the kind of things he's interested in putting forward to the British people. It's up to the people to decide whether that's something that they would be interested in supporting.
You've made some, not commitments, but broad aspirational statements, and I suppose the worry is that they will turn into policy that is broad. We were talking earlier on about one of the problems with government offering us a complex problem, a sweeping solution. I hope you'll say you're not going to do that, but in the document we've seen so far, a couple of things stand out, and the first is there is no mention of shooting, either positively or negatively, which you must be able to see here. What's your personal view about that?
Look, my personal view is the reason I come here for 3 years running is I've talked to and been briefed by excellent people from BASC who have explained the issues to me, and we will only intervene or act whether we see that there is a problem. And at the moment, I don't see there are problems that require reams and reams in manifestos about these issues. So we want the countryside to prosper and succeed, and we understand the role that shooting plays in the rural economy. So I hope that gives you some reassurance.
Well, I'm not asking you for a hard commitment, but broadly speaking, just to reaffirm that point, you cannot see a problem with shooting at the moment, and if you do, you're talking to BASC about it.
Absolutely. Look, our approach on a lot of these things is going to be regulatory. And I mean, sometimes people say to me, what's Labour's policy? And I'm tempted to say, well, do you understand what the current government's policy is? Because it kind of changed. I think since I've been last here, we've had three Prime Ministers and 3 Secretaries of State. And I think it's fair to say that policy has fluctuated. So that's happening in government. So I don't think it's surprising that the opposition is hardly going to be setting out hard and fast ideas at this point, when frankly we don't know when the election's coming, we don't know what the wider circumstances are going to be. But on issues like this, I mean, what I can say to you is that I still think it's disappointing that the government's rural minister, and I have a lot of time for Lord Bennion, I think he's a very good minister, but he's in the House of Lords. And I think actually the rural minister should be in the House of Commons, because I think that's where the questions can be asked and the accountability lies. So there are things that we would want to do differently, and I would just gently say that if you look back on the last Labour government, I think there were some things that people here did not welcome, but there are other things, particularly in terms of supporting the rural economy, which I think probably people did welcome, which then got stripped away. So I would always say that you can get a general sense of what we're likely to do in terms of how we tried to help support the rural economy before, because I think there are plenty of parts of the country I see travelling around where if you ask the question, what are the health services like, is it possible to see a dentist, that kind of thing, the answer is not good.
It is. It has been a period of fluctuation in policy, and many people here believe that it is the department for losing the rural vote at the moment.
I missed that.
Many people here believe that the DEFRA is the department for losing the rural vote, which is very good for you. One of the biggest problems has been the fluctuation in relationship and their failure to consult, which some people here believe is a problem at civil service level. Now, I know politicians never criticise the civil service, but we have lost touch, it seems to me, especially over issues like the GL43, the release of pheasants near European protected areas. if that is that something you can stop if you were to be elected to do that?
Yeah, well, look, there's a whole range of issues in there. I mean, DEFRA is a complicated department with a number of arm's length agencies. So whether it's Natural England, the Environment Agency, the Rural Payments Agency, or whatever. And the question, the extent to which politicians have day-to-day control over those things is something which is probably worth thinking about. But at the moment, a lot of those decisions, of course, as you say, are made by people which are effectively quite a long way from the elected representatives. Now, some of those are quite controversial decisions, and I think there's a legitimate question there as to whether that's the right way to do it. Now, we're not going to go steaming in, turning everything upside down, because that would be a foolish approach to take. But I think if you stand back and ask yourself, if you get a blank sheet of paper, is this a system you design? I'm not sure it is. So over time, if we can see that there are things that need to be changed and improved, I'm certainly up for looking at that. But to start with, we just need to reassure people that if there's a change of government, and look, no one knows, but if there is, I want to reassure people that there's not going to be a sudden... What we don't want is a repeat of what happened just a bit later last summer, when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng thought you could come in, turn everything upside down, and suddenly within a month, we're all a lot poorer because the markets took a dim view. That's not what we're going to do.
We have seen some of your colleagues on the Labour front bench in environment take sides on shooting recently. United Utilities, a big water company up in the northwest, announced the end of grouse shooting leases, which we consider to be an environmental disaster. Obviously, the anti-hunting conservation industry believes to be an environmental plus. And there was a sense of taking sides from your direct EFRA colleagues with United Utilities on that decision. That was disappointing.
Well, look, I think as you've seen in government, there are different views within government and within parties. My role, I'm the Shadow Food, Farming, Fisheries and Rural Affairs Minister. My role is to stand up for you and the people associated with the countryside. We've announced a pretty clear set of things which we think are pretty tough on the water companies. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a kind of industry at the moment on being tough on water companies, but we think that the measures we've outlined would have a strong effect. But let's not kid ourselves here. Some water companies, and they're not all the same, some water companies clearly have ended up more being a financial extraction mechanism rather than dealing with our water system. And that is very disappointing, to put it mildly. The regulatory system clearly did not work. But if we want to get the kind of environmental outcomes I think we all seek in future, at some point there is going to have to be money spent. That's going to come from somewhere. I would also just gently say that if in 2010 the incoming administration, then Conservative and Liberal Democrat, hadn't basically weakened so many of the building provisions, quite a lot of the houses we've seen built over that time could have been built to much higher standards, and it's much more expensive to retrofit all these things than if those standards had been applied at the time. So, some of these things were down to political choices that would have been different if we'd had a different government.
That is a hindsight point, though. You have the advantage of.
Well, isn't hindsight, because we said it at the time. But they made their decisions, and they must live by them. And there are consequences to those decisions. And I'm afraid, to some extent, we're going to have to come and clean up the mess.
The River Wye is suffering from water companies. It's suffering from planning, because you can put up chicken sheds, you can put in poor quality sewage systems, and that will pollute the River Wye, and it's suffering from agriculture. Are you going to look at all those things? Can we rely on you to look at all those things?
Well, I spend a lot of time talking to the poultry sector, and I visited one of the biggest poultry processing plants only a couple of weeks ago, and been talking to people in the biomass sector as well. Frankly, I do not quite understand why we managed to get ourselves in such a mess there. I think it's a complex set of issues. I get different advice from different people as to what the solution might be, but clearly there is a problem. And now who should pay for it is, I think, an interesting issue, and how it's going to get resolved. But we cannot have a situation where our food system is, as an unintended consequence, trashing our environment. I mean, that is a conclusion that Henry Dimbleby came to in his excellent report, which sadly it seems to me the government has rather pushed into the long grass. So there's some big changes I would want to see in the way the food system works in future. But we also, I suspect, all kind of expect that somewhere out there is a relatively affordable chicken sandwich. And that has to be produced. And there are consequences to the way it's produced. So none of this is simple. And I'm not quick to condemn anybody involved in this because I think it is complicated.
Two things your policy document has said, which clearly you're committed to, and we've talked about them in the past. But I'd be interested in just a little bit more detail about how. One is your commitment to ban trail hunting, the activity of running dogs with horses across open ground. And the other is your commitment to ban, you said, both the import and the export of trophies. On the trail hunting thing, one of the problems they've had there, you've had there, your side has had there, has been you can't put a dog in the dock. You can't see what the intention of a dog is. How can you create a law that doesn't cross-examine the intention of the hound?
Look, I understand your line of questioning, and I also understand why it's a very sensitive issue. But look, in the end, as democratic politicians, we have to respond to where the public is at on this. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that the public is not very keen on this. Now, equally, I'm not in the business of stopping people doing things which are illegal and they've done for a long time. So I'm quite happy to have a discussion around good regulation. Now, again, some of my colleagues will take a different view from me, but I'm happy to engage in that conversation. And I would just say that for those who are involved and concerned about this, and making sure that the rules are properly followed and obeyed, and is good regulation, could well be the way forward. But I won't, it won't hide anything from you. There are plenty of people who just want it stopped completely. So let's see what we can do on that. On the trophy ban, I have to say it's something I'm much less involved with. It's not my part of the brief. But I fully see there is a debate around this issue, which crosses both parties, and it is a complicated set of issues because it's pretty clear that there are some who would argue that in terms of the conservation work that's been done in other parts of the world, there are potential downsides, but equally that could possibly be done in another way. So I think, again, the British public is pretty clear where they stand, and as democratically elected politicians, we need to be more than cognizant of that.
Okay, well, I think we could argue about where the public stands on this based on the question you asked them, but on the trail hunting side, it's been part of banning hunting, which Tony Banks called a totemic issue. Your late former colleague Tony Banks called it a totemic issue. Other people have called it a punishment beating for the miners' strike. It's been in the Labour Party manifesto since 1983, the famous longest suicide note in history, and you achieved it in 2004, and yet now you apparently want to rewrite it because it didn't work. So how are you going to rewrite it so that it works?
Well, look, obviously that was a very lengthy and complicated debate at the time as to how that legislation should be introduced.
700 hours of parliamentary time.
Indeed. I'm sure there were some who wondered whether it was all time well spent, but we have the legislation, but we are repeatedly advised by a number of people that legislation is not working in the way it was intended to do, and therefore it is, in our view, worth revisiting. But I think I'm trying to give you quite a lot of scope here to read what I'm saying, that I'm very open to having a discussion as to how we can make that legislation work.
Okay, thank you. We'll give you that one. The trophy hunting question is interesting because where Boris Johnson wanted to ban the import of trophies and has so far failed, you want to ban the import and export of trophies while at the same time promoting deer stalking. Can we talk about what you mean by that? Is it, again, the totemic idea of trophies?
Well, look, let me go back to right where I began with this, that the detail of legislation, we do not have the capacity in opposition to get into fine detail because, quite simply, we don't have the capacity. That is why we have civil servants. So we're setting out broad ideas. I think you will find frequently in terms of, it's exactly the same with the current government, they talked about things in opposition, which when they came into government and looked at the detail, they needed to revisit that. So the overall aim, I think, is clear. How it is achieved, sometimes you have to get into detail and talk to people who know, with practical experience about what will work and what won't work. Parliament is full of examples, I'm afraid, of legislation that's been brought in and then not much follow-up to see whether what actually happened was what was intended. And that's one of the, I'm afraid, the ongoing faults with our system. But for all its faults, I wouldn't swap it for another system, but that is something Parliament could almost certainly do better.
Well, the last Conservative government managed to bring in a variety of animal welfare and sentience acts that have all, one way or another, failed. I know you maybe don't want to dwell on private grief, but is something you must look at and go, this is a tricky area. The Kept Animals Bill, did you support that?
Well, I was the opposition spokesperson leading on it. So there were many measures in there, particularly around the worrying of animals, for instance, which I'm astonished that the government has chosen to ditch. Obviously, the puppy smuggling issues, the pet theft issues. Some of them are complicated. I mean, as drafted, in fact, Victoria Prentice was here this time last year, and I remember teasing her gently about a particularly catty column that Quentin Letts had written about her, which I thought was a bit unfair, but quite funny. Some of these things are difficult to do, but equally, the public absolutely wants us to do some of these things. Having your pet stolen is a really horrible experience. And to treat it just as having a watch stolen, I think it's reasonable to say that's not how it feels to people. But as you think through the ramifications of who owns the pet, it becomes quite complicated. And as I say, as first drafted, it was dreadful. It was hopeless. And it was me, actually, that pointed that out at the time. And they went away, supposedly to redraft it. But they've now taken away all the stuff. And of course, that is a very strange piece of legislation in that it includes the keeping of primates, for instance, which I think people will be shocked. Now, I was shocked when I was told that in every town you will find a caged primate. Who knew? I'm shocked. But there are thousands of intelligent animals being kept in cages in this country at the moment.
Okay, let's just on that. I mean, so sentience, do you have a definition for, which is an act they've brought in? I still think the Tories don't understand what it is. My burglar alarm is sentient.
I'm not sure it's sentient in quite the way that a living creature is. I mean, I'm not a biologist. I also did the animal sentience bill, and warned at the time that it may not work in quite the way it was intended. The committee has been set up, apparently. I got that wrong the other day. I wasn't even aware they had actually established a committee yet, so I'm not quite sure what it's done so far. But George Eustace was quite clear to point out that in the end it won't be the committee making the decision. The committee will give the Secretary of State advice.
The DEFRA Secretary of State is good. So you effectively have the third revising chamber of the House of Parliament at DEFRA. So any legislation that affects either livestock or octopuses is now subject to your veto. That's quite a nice thing to inherit.
That's my understanding of it, but as I say, we haven't yet seen. Remember, of course, it's replaced existing EU legislation, which was studiously vague on the issue, I think it's fair to say, and that was open to. I'm sorry, I hope there aren't any environmental lawyers in the room because it's get rather tedious. But my sense from the Amsterdam Treaty, and I'm not a lawyer, was that it was possible for different countries, guess what, to interpret it differently according to their particular culture and circumstances, which suited everybody. And so I'm not sure. Personally, it was necessary. In fact, I argued specifically we were better off, guess what, with the existing situation, which seemed to be working reasonably well. We now created a new situation which could go in a number of different directions.
Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Zeichner, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.